mathematician doing lots of simulations, I believe. And yeah, I've sort of ran into Anna many years ago, really, when I was in my.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sort of vaguely been yeah.
But now we professionally do something together instead of just talk. Well, again, we're talking to students how to be the mathematician, right?
Right. So
yeah.
it's
something.
It's so you know what you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
it's sad but true.
Sad but true. Yes. So, but yeah, would you all please welcome Anna and.
Thanks, Andy. All right, so nice to see you. I usually try to, people. So we'll see how that works with the webcam. People shout at me, please, even through like microphone and stuff, if I do something that you can't see or something like that, because I'm not that good at, looking back. All right. So after this preamble, when people ask me, what is your talk at UQ going to be about? Well, it's basically the Richard Scarry book, but I'm probably not going to be the guy at the sawmill and the lumberjack chopping the wood and falling into the river. I do something different. I play SimCity for a living, which is basically, it's literally my job. And that's why I'm going to talk about it. A tiny bit about myself. So yeah, why would you do simulations, for a job? Well, in my case, you would do it because when your mathematician mum brought home the first Commodore 64 of Hungary in, 1983, 1984, sometime around that point, and made an animation of lion faces flying across the screen, you knew I am gonna do something with computers. I'm not sure what, but this is kind of what I want to do with my life. And admittedly, very few lions have flown across my screens so far, so my career goal is not quite there yet. But then I spent inordinate amounts of time becoming a pro X-Wing pilot, continued with letting many people die at Mud, and I was a really bad mayor for SimCity 2000 as well. But you can kind of see a pattern here, right? Simulating stuff that is not really trying to, be good at it. Turns out that is not something they teach at uni like directly, they don't call it that. So I ended up doing a maths degree first and then got lured into pure maths. If anyone knows what regularity theory is, that's the thing where you recognize, oh, I can't actually solve these differential equations, but if I look at like the coefficients, I can at least tell whether the numerical approximation is going to fall over or not. And then you do the terrible proof so that people doing the numerical approximation can actually figure out how to do that. And like have this like little one prerequisite for their theorem, like that, yes, this works. It's also incredibly useful in the real world. Do you see on this green flyer, and it also was in a big poster, that kind of scary math in the background and in one of the circles? Yeah, that's from my thesis. And the Uni of Erlangen-Nuremberg, where I did my PhD, uses the scary maths from my PhD to, scare and impress people on their marketing materials to this day. So, this is definitely the biggest real world impact my maths ever had. Well, yes, and then after a short stint of, actually working at a uni and trying to do math research, not being particularly good at it, loving teaching, but that's really not how you make a career at a uni. I decided that I'm going to do what I actually like getting out of bed for, which is basically building the software to track the students in the beginners lectures and, figure out how people get, their tutorial partners and how you get the grades and how everyone can do this sort of automatically. So why not just actually develop software? And then it was, oh yeah, but software development isn't hiring at the moment when I moved to Australia. So I went to a place called the Simulation Group, which surprisingly dealt in building simulations for clients and consulting on the basis of that. Spent about 10 years there, then they got bought by Boston Consulting. And I don't really like the 60-hour weeks type of thing. And So I basically just jumped to the client that I was working for most of the time anyway. It's called the Integrated Logistics Company. That's literally where I came from today. And I also started a little freelancing gig, basically to keep selling the software that I used to sell when I worked in TSG, which is called AnyLogic. That's a simulation package. Pretty okay, but also very expensive, so maybe not. Right. So this is why you do simulation as a person who, you know, does it because they like it. But why would you do simulation as, you know, someone who is the person receiving the results? Well, in a nutshell, if you want to describe something quantitatively, you end up with a word problem. And from a word problem, you end up with an equation or 2 or 17. They are pretty hard to figure out in the first place. And then they're even worse to solve. To partial differential equations, you can't even solve them. You have to approximate them, blah, blah, blah. And then you have maybe a solution, but how does that look? What does it tell me about the result? It's tricky. So a pretty, you know, fake out type of result approach, but it works, is to say, well, let's just see what happens. Let's not worry about analytical properties. Let's not worry about, you know, maximum, minimum, optimum, whatever. Let's just see what happens and see what we can use from that. At least it happens in a computer cheaply, as opposed to you have built your massive piece of infrastructure expensively and then you find out. Right? So let's just try. And for simulation, you can in principle use whatever you want, you're good at, is suitable to that specific situation. Like something like fantasy football or fantasy baseball, that's nothing else but a simulation on pen and paper. Or, you know, Dungeons and Dragons is literally a simulation on a tabletop and in people's heads. Spreadsheets are pretty popular. I'm sure there are some people in the audience who also like model trains. They're pretty good. Their 3D flashy factory simulations are a tiny bit, you know, less quaint, but more popular these days. And what do people use for tools when it comes to mathy things? Well, whatever they have at the time. So the first thing that people came up with saying, hey, let's use computers to simulate this was when Jay Forrester, who was, by the way, an amazing computing pioneer, came up with the idea of systems dynamics. He went, okay, so I have these processes, they're kind of interlinked, they have feedback loops and whatever, they have complexity, but I could describe them with a partial differential equation or with a single one, but like a system. Okay, who likes differential equations? Okay, this is one person. Like, I did my PhD in them. Okay, so this is how bad they are. I look at an equation, a differential equation, and I go like, I have no idea what this is going to do. I don't even know what this is describing. But if you draw a picture like that, that's actually not even a bad way of describing it, even to a person who doesn't have that, right? Like, for example, this is the super classic Banks diffusion model of how do people want to buy a product? So I don't know. And you have basic programs of people who buy and people who already bought said item. And you have different interactions with people. Like, you know, people who haven't bought one can turn into people who have bought one, and you can try to get them there in different ways. Give them advertisements, right? You could have the adopters, people who have already bought one, talk to the potential adopters, and tell them, look, this is so great, you're not cool otherwise, right? And they turn into adopters. So the rate at which people turn from I haven't got one to I have one is kind of described by, you know, a rate. As long as we're not too worried about the resolution of this and individual properties of people, it's fine, right? We can just average them out. It's kind of all an equation, but we make a nice picture of it. We hide the maths in the arrows of, you know, how things influence each other. We maybe annotate this thing with, you know, oh, one is a balancing loop, the other is a reinforcing loop, you know, like a conversion circle, stuff like that. But we basically make a picture of the system of equations, and then we stick this into a computer solver. We just play out how the equations are going to behave and what the results are like. This was a massive win at, I think, GE. We suddenly understood how things like, you know, if you start producing like crazy, some kind of product, then you have market saturation, you stop producing it, then your stock gets sold out, and then people are desperate, but you don't have stock to sell them. How these kinds of cycles work. Apparently, this was like the BCs in the 50s to understand this kind of, dynamic system in a kind of quantified way and be able to, describe it in a way that you can put it in front of a manager. Oh, wow, this makes sense. So it was really popular with actual users. And also, why would you use this as your way of modeling with computers? Well, computers weren't that great, but numerical solvers for differential equations had already been developed at a usable level. So that was how it started with computers. And, it went from data factories and market analysis to let's simulate the entire world. There's literally there's a really funny video from the ABC, I think, about, looks like lab assistant, aged look, girl, like 20s. She's got a white lab coat on. She's typing into one of those telephone computers. And she's programming this simulation of the world that is telling us that pollution is going to wipe out almost everyone. It's really funny. You can simulate everything, right? And it's really nice if you are just interested in like general feedback loops, dynamics, and so on. It's not great if you want to go for stochasticity or individual effects or small group sizes or like specific decision processes. So people quickly came up with other ways of simulating slightly more, down-to-earth systems. And that was called process-based simulation in the 60s. Basically, if you have a process, you make it into steps and you make the computer execute those steps. It's literally what you guys have done. That was the last few weeks. Having queues, having delays, deciding which queue to go into, deciding whether you need a resource or whether you have time it, deciding whether the queue has space, things like that. It's basically the bread and butter of what was then called discrete event simulation. Why do we call it discrete event? Because the basic idea of it is that discretize your time. Nothing happens between the actual moments that we look at. The actual moment is called an event. It takes 0 time. In between is when time flows. And you can update the state of your system only at events. Now, to know how your system got updated, of course, you can consider, change must have happened since the last event. Like if the train travels from A to B, your events are train starts at A and train arrives at B, for example. And you don't look at what happened in between, but you know that the train went at 100 kilometers an hour. So you know how to update the position at the time of event B. But it's really nice if you have a finite amount of computing power, but you have a decent amount of memory already, and you can sort of handle that with a procedural programming language, which happened to come up in the 60s. And it was also in the 60s, Algol 69, which was the first object-oriented programming language, developed for this kind of thing, exactly for this kind of thing. And then it got forgotten. It turns out that object-oriented needs a lot more power than this. So this got incredibly popular. This kind of simulation is bread and butter for pretty much every single piece of software that you can commercially buy it for the simulation software. You plunk down the process, you have many graphs, you might not have to implement queues yourself. That's one of the important, right? You don't have to implement it yourself. All the hard mathsy, computer sciencey, whatever stuff has been done. You really just need to know, what does my process look like? Is it a factory? Is it a swimming pool? Is it a supermarket? Doesn't matter. You figure out your process, you say how long it takes, what your ifs and thens are. You write it down in a pretty flow chart, and hooray, it works. And it doesn't entirely happen like that, but it sort of works like that. You just don't want to look what's on the inside of it. But this works quite well if you have a system where you know how the rules work. It's governed by rules in the first place. And you want to know, for example, how wrong can it go? How well can it go? all the stochastic effects and the variation that you experience just by having one person needing 2 minutes to fill out a form and the other person 10 minutes to find out when you're going to get next. All of these random effects are going to be really nicely there in the outcome. So this is an incredibly useful way of simulating practical things. Sometimes it's a bit tricky to use, but incredibly popular. And as soon as you go away from the really big qualitative questions, you land here. But then in the 70s, people came up with another perspective. What if we don't have rules that everyone has to go through and basically look at like a script? I go here, I go there, I make a decision, and everyone going through the same process. What if we could simulate individual decisions of the things that I'm modeling, that they contain sort of inside of themselves, as opposed to going through an external process? This perspective flip is called agent-based modeling. It's also a simulation word for object orientation. So it sounds very fancy, and you want to drop the word agent-based modeling. It sounds cool, but conceptually, it's just incredibly logical and obvious that okay, maybe I want to make individual decisions instead of sending someone to a decision-making place, right? There are the classics such as the Schelling segregation model, where you say, okay, I have a lattice of individuals, and they, at every time step, they basically all look around and go like, do my neighbors look like myself? If yes, then fine, I'm going to stay put. If not, then I switch places with a random other person, see how I go. Turns out this kind of dynamic does lead to pretty segregated sets of agents. So this kind of thing is used a bunch, for example, in like sociology, social sciences generally, population modeling, and also biology, transport, pretty much everything where you have like a whole number, a massive number of little things that do something, and you don't have like a big process, but you want to see the emergent behavior that comes out of the simple little individual rules. And this can go really well, right? Like what bacteria do, how they do chemotaxis. Like no one tells the bacterium, you go that way, you go that way, you go that way, but they all end up going sort of the same way. Same thing with the birds, how they just look at, how the bird next to them flies and go like, oh yeah, I don't want to bump into him, but kind of the same way would be nice. And they manage to have a pretty good time. So it's very interesting in terms of seeing how could behavior emerge if you don't see a controlling entity. At the same time, this how could the behavior emerge is exactly what makes it tricky for practical application. In a process-based simulation, if you say, okay, I'm going to change my rules a little bit, everyone has to take 10 minutes longer at this step, 2 minutes shorter at this step. It's kind of easy to predict the result and see how the rules and the result interact. It's not necessarily linear, but it's reasonably obvious. Whereas when you go agent-based, like purely agent-based, and decisions are basically made by little individuals with more or less input from everyone else, that is pretty much chaos. So the chances of actually understanding what drives your outcomes and how to influence them to do what you actually want to end up with becomes a lot trickier. Like at which point trial and error, right? Like playing with your parameters, trying to see if you can change your internal rules a little bit, something like this. But it's just you see the behavior from the chaos, but now you have to go and explain it. And then in around early to mid 2000s and then around 2010, people realized that, hey, we don't actually have to stick to one of these ideas. Why not just mix them all together? Like you could mix, like your agents don't have to be just simple and just do their own thing. They could do their own thing, but at the same time, also have external rules imposed on them. And why do all parts of my model have to work in the same way? Why do I have to model the weather in the exact same way as I would model the inside of a truck or the behavior of pedestrians? So people came up with, these combination ideas. Technology had advanced pretty far, we have things like, you know, proper computers at this point. We have things like the internet. We have things like databases. Oh, we could actually use serious real-life data to feed into our models as opposed to, you know, 3 little manually typed in things in a little window interface, right? So all of these technologies coming together inspired enough people to come up with the word hybrid simulation, where you go, okay, I'm going to go agent-based, but then these agents can go into a process that I'm going to model, and they can interact with the process, and I can model a different kind of agent around them, and I can use GIS data with that, and I can use global databases with that, and I can put maybe a bit of, you know, market cycles or whatever system dynamics in the background just to see what happens if I go long term. And then the whole thing could run not locally, but distributed on the cloud and the database. And all of these things are hybrid. Now, not just one group of people came up with that. AnyLogic as a company coined the term, but it wasn't new at that point. There's a heap of solutions for simulation out there. Some of them free, some of them really expensive. So here's on the right is a scale for the cost. There is how graphical or code based you work. If you want to be for free and you like coding, SimPy is absolutely excellent. If you also have money to throw at the thing, then SLX is even nicer. Just the inside of SLX are wonderful. The one problem is that the guy who has it is dead and no one else. There are free Java-based simulations such as Gamson. There are expensive ones such as AnyLogic. There are a whole bunch of proprietary, more or less expensive ones such as Arena, which is just the 70s and still industry standard, and Simio, which is way better, expensive, which is graphical, but for some reason getting popular. Method and Simulate deserve an honorable mention because if you want to simulate NFC electronics, you definitely want to use Method and Simulate. Also, when I was like 15, I used to have a Method and Simulate poster on the wall of my bedroom, and I thought we have this to kind of tell you how all this stuff is. Right, so there's choice. And the nice thing about the commercial packages is most of them have the academic version. Most of them have a for free learning version because they want to sucker in people who are getting into simulation right, and they want to sucker in people who learn it at university. So if you are ever asked, oh, have you ever heard of this package? Then if you have like 3 days before you have to respond, download the free version, try it, see if you like it, and then you can say yes if you feel like learning it, or no, I don't want to learn it. But the try before you buy it. So it's quite good. Oops. Thanks, chat guys. Okay, so now let's turn from the semi-theoretical to the practical bit. We're back to why simulate. Well, mostly because we want to save massive amount of money, or because we don't want to make really bad mistakes that are very hard to fix. Let's do these things in a computer first. Now, there are a number of fields where you can say, okay, we want to not make expensive mistakes, and we want to save money. Health is one of them. Defense is one of them. Mining is one of them. Because, you know, like digging a hole, it's really expensive. It's very expensive to undo, and if you get it wrong, it makes a big difference. Out of these fields, well, health doesn't have that much money to get itself right, and it has a lot of, you know, competing interests and stuff. Defense does incredible amounts of incredibly exciting simulation. I happen to work in the mining bit of it. So my specific area is pretty much, you know, everything that is central Queensland coal. Yeah, I've probably simulated. So specific one I work at is called the Darlymple Bay Coal Train. Wonderful work to do. Started out with 2 terminals, 3 companies running trains, and 26 mines. Some of them share their loadout points, so that is great. The trucks belong to someone else entirely, and those people want to make extra tracks. You know, it's basically a big system that has lots of actors in it. And not entirely unexpectedly, it doesn't work too well. If it worked well, no one would want anyone to simulate it. Right? It would be like, everything hunky boring. But it doesn't work too well. System should be working at 85 million tons per annum, or as my physicist colleague says, megatons per annum, and everyone really loves the form analogies. But typical performance when we started the Foeglein simulator was like 65 million tons per annum, and that was really super well. And yeah, that's big loss when you're trying to, actually do business. It's also not that great when you are trying to, do your business. You have like literally 100 ships sitting in the harbour in front of the terminal going, can I please have my call? And the best thing about it is that royalties are structured in a way that if you need to pay the late fees for the ships, that comes out of the money that should go to the ships. So it doesn't even hurt whoever is messing up this entire system. Who it hurts in the end is the state should be receiving the royalties. So yeah, there was a problem where basically Whitson said, okay, so you solve it yourselves, or we regulate you for you. At which point the companies say, oh yeah, we're going to. It didn't help that then they connected in another terminal who now have trains that are going the wrong way and blocking each other. The simulation project started, we struggled for like 3 to 4 years. This was one of the wonderful things coming out of it. It was so popular. It's animation, see how these little coal trains are going through an inverter? Yeah, really cool. It's as useful as going out to that actual place on the hill and looking at it, and you're like, yeah, it's cool, and it's black, and it goes right, and it goes. So it's nice to have. It's really good for stakeholder engagement. It's also not exactly solving. Next thing is, okay, let's do this in the computer with the seeing things. At least now with color coding and stuff, I can see what coal is on the train as opposed to, yeah, it's black. But it's still not telling me why something is happening and what exactly is happening. So there's the part where you go, okay, so let's just look, I don't know, at the actual code. Maybe it's going to tell me why something is happening. And when you look at this and you're like, okay, this is a bunch of digestives. That's what logic really is. And you see a lot of discussing Java and a lot of hidden Java, and it doesn't tell you anything. It's just really good for scaring people. So that's years and years of work and still not really good, a good solution. And yes, you can say, oh wait, we tried what happens if we switch the port off, and guess what? Everything works. And we tried what happens if we really switch the rail off, and everything just happens well. And it works. And when we put the two together, it doesn't work. And why? Right? So that's not a great solution. So you try to look at model outputs. This mind could do this, like that mind gave you that much. Yeah, that's not a why, right? You can try, okay, but photo perform best. Again, why? Oh, what did we really spend our time on? That's a why. You can make sort of more that you graphs and everything out of that. You try to tell that to the people actually running the system, and they basically go, well, I don't want to use it because it's way too complicated. Also, we don't like numbers. But also honorable mention, one of them said we got like graphs because we want numbers. And graphs are not numbers. Yes, that was great. So yeah, it's great to have a model, but in a classic repeat of what I experienced in every single applied maths course I ever took at uni, it's this extremely disappointing thing where you have your, yes, this is going to tell me an answer. This is going to tell me what happened. And then you run the thing and you get a gigabyte of numbers out if you put the logs at a high level. And they're just numbers and no understanding and no knowledge. And it's what do I do with them? This is like when you go to the signal analysis course, you think, this is cool. It's going to tell me how wavelets work. It's going to tell me how JPEGs work, and it's just brilliant. It was kind of the same feeling. So suddenly you end up teaching yourself all of these fancy things like R and Python. And let's be perfectly honest about it, Excel is not even that bad. You just know what is good at or not. But you basically work a lot at analyzing data of varying quality. And you have to figure out the why from that. And it's a needle in a haystack, trial and error type of thing, trying to form hypotheses and then test them by running experiments. But half the time you can't directly control what you're trying to control, so you can proxy with it. It's kind of science, not even math. It's proper like experimental science. Your experiment isn't kind of, pendulum or bunny or something. It's something that you build in the computer. And it's quite fun, especially when you find something that is that's funny. I wonder if it's real. You find it in the field. Once you figure stuff out, which we have been, and right now the performance is around 80 million, because that's how much there is. You can reuse the models, which is awesome. Because once you know that it's actually depicts my system decently, you can say, okay, what would happen if I had to fix that machine for half a year? What would happen if I opened another mine? Oh, everyone, just give me your maintenance and sales plans. I throw them together. I tell you what to look at for next year. All of these things we basically do as an ongoing project. And most of the time you think, how hard can this be? I'm throwing together these numbers. I'm going to get something out. It's going to be a beautiful prediction or a forecast, and it's going to be great. And something goes wrong every single month, and you have a wonderful effective work last moment deadline investigation every single month. So, anyone who is up for the excitement of, the part where the thesis is going wrong, but get it back on track in the last moment. Yeah, simulation is great for it. It's going to break at the perfect moment. Same thing with, do we want to take out machines? Do we want to upgrade something? How do we want to upgrade something? How do we want to operate things? It's really nice when you have your people who are operating the real thing talk to you and explain to you what they do and how they do it. Like, did you guys know that coal catches on fire all by itself? If you just have it sit, it does. The more enclosed the spaces, the more because like methane comes out of it. Because like methane is in the little bits of coal, like in the pores. But then when you dig it up, the pressure isn't there to hold it in anymore, so it kind of comes out. But this is also an exothermic process. So it gets hot in the process. So therefore, if you have coal sitting at something like a, nicely breezy terminal right at the beach, pretty much, it's okay because the methane is just carried away by the wind and everything's fine. But if you have it sit, for example, in a power plant, and you had a warmish winter and you didn't use as much coal as you thought you'd use, there's a pretty good chance of it catching on fire. Happened in Erlangen. That was like, wow, who knew? Or you learn things about, how people have brains. It's quite cool. You also discuss with people whether, what they're doing is the best thing they could be doing. And that's the part where you also have the chance to do what we call people skills. It's quite interesting, and depending on how much you like seeing how people can be, gently pushed from one way of working to another way of working while everyone is happy in the process. I thought the company I work in is perfect for that. Like, how to improve processes in a way that people who come along for the journey first hate you, and in the end, actually want to work more with you because they feel like doing something. Right, so quick recap. Why do we simulate? Because it's cheaper and faster than doing the real thing, because it gives you understanding, and because by knowing what you want to do with the model, you figure out what you're going to build. Like, if I want to just simulate how a hospital is going to work roughly, I don't want to do, I want to simulate every bed. Just, you know, positive 10, 10,000, right? If I want to know how the bacteria go between beds, I need to simulate every bed. So these questions, they inform your build and they inform what you are developing. Right, let's get a tiny bit into semi-practice. Who has heard the word mathematize? It's one of the important things of the new Australian math curriculum, guys. So mathematizing is really the word, is really the thing where you have the real life situation and you put it in some kind of practice, which is actually a very legitimate concept, but you know, if you put it out there and show it to some slightly conservative people, it's not going to get you a lot of friends. Turning a question into something that can be quantified or even better simulated. How does that work? Well, if you have, for example, a question like, why is my process not delivering the throughput I want? That's why. Well, a simulation can't, because that needs actual thinking. What a simulation can do is answer an if-then question. What if I do this, then this will happen? So you need to figure out what you want to, how you would answer the why question, and then put those into how much, what, which questions. Like, what is the net time cost of my practice elements? Or how do I design my reporting system to be robust? Simulations are not going to design. But what you can do is test design. Like, if I have a reporting system like that, what is the chance of it getting overwhelmed? You can simulate that with the kind of thing that you are building with the queues and the processes. Or who's to blame for this office being over budget? That's one of the best kinds of questions, right? Whose fault is this exactly? And while we're not saying it out loud, half of the studies that you know, stakeholders asked us to do at integrated logistics is exactly, am I getting ripped off? Very legit question. It's just you don't want to say it while everyone else is hearing it. So you can imagine a more objective type of thing with what part of the office is over provision, or you know, what is my cost benefit on this process? So what basically makes a question good? It should be linked to a decision that needs to be made. Why? Because simulation is extremely work intensive. It takes time to build, it takes time to evaluate. You don't want to, you know, answer a question that literally won't make a difference. You want to link back to your organization's goals so that you know the decision you're making is actually relevant and not just a detail. You want it to be bounded because it's really easy to get lost in making details and just growing, scope, which is very entertaining, but also very stressful when you get to the point at the end of things. You want it to be specific, so you know what to write in the final report. And yeah, okay, the big quantifier, right? Like we're going to deal with numbers here. Right. Some terminology, which you've already seen, but that's the case you want to, you know, put some words around. An experiment is one where your input variables, we call them control variables, are the inputs or the levers. The response variables are the output measures, and people really like to see them in graphs like this. That's how you show the raw results. But then making an answer out of the raw results is the part where you need thinking and interpretation, and at some point a value judgment. For example, say you are at Australia Post, right? You want to see your queue length. What is you want to service how many people come up in the CBD every day? Okay, a queue length that's like, I don't know, average queue length for people. Right. The queue length you have at lunchtime, like, you know, snaking out the post office square, definitely not good. But what is the point that you're happy with, where you'd go, oh yeah, I can do that to people. I can do that to people half the time. I can do that to people 2 hours a day, right? This is the point where you have the value judgment. This is the part where it links back and goes from the simulation to the either consulting or just throwing it back to the client. Right, I think we can skip the part with model details because it's pretty much linked back to this. If it's useful, put it in. careful, because it's risky to put in detail. The more detail you put in, the more data you need to feed it with. The more data you need to feed it with, the more certain you have to be that you have good data. And it turns out that you often don't have good data. My absolute favorite of the not good data was a certain model about barging on a river in Indonesia. And it was a pretty cool long river, like hundreds of kilometers long. It starts with like in the middle of the jungle where it's like really going up and down in level. There are bridges that are too low, so if the water is too high, you can't go under the bridge. If the water is too low, you can't go over the rocks a few meters down. So you sort of want to know how much can you barge on this river, really, how useful is it going to be. So you'll have to have this river like that. How do you do that? Well, there should be historical data, shouldn't there? But of course, you don't have gauges everywhere, and you don't have that gauge record things at a different point in time, so it's kind of tricky. Historical data is not necessarily available. And then you come up to the point where, oh, look, my data is going reasonably, and then suddenly from that date onwards, after a gap of 3 days, everything is like a meter lower than it used to be. What happened? What happens here? Turns out, and you find this out by digging up Indonesian newspapers in Google, that this was the time when a ship basically crashed into the bridge to the gate. At which point, the whole thing was obviously in a state, but you know, how you imagine a bridge looking up the big crashing and almost collapsed. And then it put the bridge back up and it, you know, just put the gauge back somewhere. And when you look at the before and after photos, well, it's, you know, it's kind of on a different bit of bridge, and it's like in a completely different position. You can be very glad it's not us. So yeah, this kind of thing in your data. Now we're going, oh yeah, are we going to be exact on this river level? But the client wants us to see. The client also wants us to predict the once in 100 years rain events. They also want an exact correlation between the rainfall in the jungle and the level of the river. Let's get this done. So you learn a lot of things by just basically trying to talk people out of including unnecessary details. Did you know that during Ramadan, speed limits on Indonesian mountain roads are lower? Because a lot of people take the passing very seriously despite there being exemptions for prevalence. And that's why the truck drivers are hungry and grumpy, and half the time also very not rested because they use the dark time to eat, right? And therefore they can get enough sleep. So you want to have your speed limits, especially for those massive trucks on those dirt roads, so much lower. So your grumpy, hungry, tired people get, you know, simulation, data analysis. Last example, who knows this model? It's susceptible and infectious and recovered. Yeah, we saw that a bit too often in the past few years, right? This kind of model, like one of these SD ones, is what got used in, you know, actually estimating things and forming policy. And yeah, okay, it wasn't like one homogeneous group for the entire population. It was a bit compartmentalized, you know, like old people and young people, like people with different properties in their separate groups, kind of run parallel. And I'm not sure how much interaction there was between the groups, but it's just something like it. And when you think about, well, if I just have like kind of rough data about how many people, however many I have, get sick, then I can kind of calibrate the model myself. And it works okay. It's not great, but you have a rough handle on what is going on with your academic. So what you can estimate is, for example, something where you go, right, if I have the hospitals that I have now, are they going to be complete swamped? And do I need to build like big tent village hospitals? Like, you know, Spanish flu like, right? Do I need this, or is it kind of going to be okay? How is the peak of the whole process going to look? It's fine for that. You have reliable enough data for that. It runs quickly enough. Good enough. as soon as you want to do something like, yeah, but what if I told everyone to stay at home, except the kids who go to school? That's not going to go that well, right? Because suddenly we're trying to capture a dynamic that is supposed to emerge from our model, right? It's supposed to be in the model. It's going to give us our input parameter R0 under these specific circumstances. Suddenly you're like, okay, how did I get that for this model? Well, turns out, oh, we estimated it. And, you know, it's like an estimate is great when you have some, you know, precedent to go on, but it's incredibly tricky when you don't. So, I mean, that's why there's public health and epidemiologists and people who actually do this for a job in a health setting, in an epidemiology setting, having some kind of informed estimate about it. But the part where you see basically people who all have epidemiology professor titles behind their names say diametrically opposed things is because these things are sort of tricky to estimate. And it doesn't even start doing things like, yeah, actually, this is an okay kind of approximation as long as you have big enough populations and homogeneous enough populations, and everyone is kind of similarly susceptible. But as soon as you have this super spreader type of dynamic, this is not accurate. And then you have all of the agent-based people saying, okay, so let us try to simulate, I don't know, the entirety of Bangalore, where you and the people did it, and they actually had the computing power to do it, which is bloody impressive. They are their own simulation thing for that. But then suddenly you're like, okay, and how am I going to populate this exactly with input data? I want to model every school kid moving between schools and stuff like that. So suddenly you have enormous spread in your results because you had to guess your data that you're populating with to the level of granularity you need to drive dynamics like this. How reliable are your outputs? It's not a simple case of, oh yeah, I know what granularity I want to model because this is my process that I'm trying to capture. So this is the data I'm going to use. Because if your data is not spot on, you can't really trust the spreaded results. On the other hand, if you just simplify everything away, again, you can't. Which is basically why there are lots of people who practice simulation on the one hand and are just a tiny bit wary about how people use the results. On the other hand, when you're trying to, you know, explain to someone that they should really listen to the very obvious thing that every single model has predicted the same way, this is not the answer. Right. So, last question. Should you simulate something at all if it's like, you know, it's unreliable? Simple things that are clearly governed by rules, awesome. If you want to test an idea in the system, clear enough, awesome, let's do that. Stuff that should not be simulated, and that's unfortunately, especially often in academia. There's no real process that we've got, but we're trying to find something really high level. We don't, there is a process, we don't really know it, and it's not like we could measure it. We have a process, but it really depends on a lot of things that we have no visibility of. Did you know that there's data about every single Queensland case of diabetes since the 60s? About what kind of, you know, treatment modality they have, the different ways of doing dialysis and stuff. Oh, sorry, not diabetes, dialysis. You can do dialysis in many different ways, and which of the technologies they use, blah, 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 for any one of these cases. Except when you're trying to simulate this and go like, oh, what if I introduce this new pathway? Yeah, how often are you going to use it again? Who knows? Why did people make the decisions in the 80s? Who knows? Maybe the technology wasn't there. Maybe we didn't have enough tests. Maybe someone just didn't like it. Maybe they had something specific about this person that wasn't recorded. You don't see half of your process in the data. Health has this massive problem. Ooh. And finally, rare events. Not great to simulate, not enough data. Also really popular because they do massive damage, a lot of damage. People love them. Right. So, wrapping up. Why did we like simulation? For me personally, I love the math and the programming because at heart, I'm a programmer. I like the thinking and learning about random stuff, like really random stuff. And finally, the people I work with. So if you want to stick around people who have a very, very nerdy background, then yeah, this is kind of a nice niche in the general maths subculture. So TSC was basically full with academia expertise. A few people who were only engineering masters and stuff were like normal with this. No one watches Big Computer anymore, do they? You could have like very, very like seminar room like discussions at the top of my hat. I can get through a day of work with on this with worries because it's a legitimate way to convey information. The one problem is when the client comes in and he likes stuff. That's all. Okay, empathy is not bad on a t-shirt either. So anyway, altogether, it's not a terrible field to work in. It's not a terrible field to do as a hobby, or at least, have a go at. And, if you have any questions or interests, totally hit me up. And finally, I keep getting asked by people who are interested in either simulation or any logic about, oh, but do you know something like a student who's okay at programming, or a PhD student, someone like that, a bit of a programmer looking for a part-time job, stuff like that. There are heaps around, especially at universities and at like government-y, NGO-y, consultancy places. So if anyone's interested in doing simulation for that, because you like this and you kind of like to dabble with this and you want to turn the hobby into a paid hobby, then again, please get in touch, because there is a surprisingly okay job market there for both not quite finished and already graduated people who like doing programming and simulation. All right, that's it for now. I hope it was audible from the second half onwards, guys, on Zoom. Yeah, any questions? Can we go now with no question? Thank you. Right, so I do the stop share, or do I stop recording first?
Stop.
Right.